I was sent a letter recently by somebody who had written to the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, MP Lisa Nandy, regarding his concerns about the BBC's plans to cease broadcasting Radio 4 on Longwave. This, along with my research into 405 line television, really made me realise that the BBC will go ahead with this plan, despite the petitions and lobbying. Back in 1985, the 405 line television service was switched off. The population of the UK at that time was 56.55 million. It was estimated that at the time of the switch off, 1% of the population still relied on the 405 line service. That's 565,500 people, yet it was still switched off. Radio 4 in the UK has a listenership of 10 million people today. There's no solid evidence that longwave listenership is small or declining. No studies have been conducted specifically into longwave listenership, and RAJAR data doesn't separate FM and longwave listening. Even if the number of longwave listeners is as low as 1% of that 10 million people, that's still 100,000 people. If the 405 line switch off is anything to go by, these people just don't matter. There are similarities between the 405 line switch off and the threat of a Radio 4 longwave switch off. I'll tell you the story of the former soon, but it may leave you feeling deflated over the hopes of any potential delay or cancellation of the latter. The gist of the letter is that one of the challenges the BBC faces is the need to manage the transition from older analogue radio networks, faced with increased costs of radio distribution and the need to invest in new approaches to distribute content to reach its listeners. Over the past 20 years, there's been a significant shift of radio listeners from longwave, medium wave and FM to digital. Digital radio and online now account for 73.3% of total UK radio listening, according to the RAJAR figures for Q1 2025. This is largely due to increased levels of broadcasting on digital audio broadcasting, or DAB, online platforms, and the emergence of connected audio devices such as smart speakers, which accounts for 17.6% of all UK listening. Improvements to internet access and the availability of BBC radio services on TV devices mean that the vast majority of households have more options than ever before to access BBC services. The BBC announced in 2023 that it would be closing its longwave services due to low levels of listening, the extreme age of its longwave transmitting equipment, and the costs, in particular the energy costs, of maintaining the service. The BBC is operationally and editorially independent from the government, and we cannot intervene in its day-to-day operations. This means that the decision on transmissions and distribution of its services, including for how much longer it maintains Radio 4 longwave, are wholly a matter for the BBC. It went on to say, regarding your concerns about longwave and emergency broadcasts, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has worked closely with the BBC on this matter. We hope that you will understand that we are unable to provide the details. Nonetheless, we are able to reassure you that the BBC has detailed plans and procedures, which are tested regularly, for maintaining resilient communications to the public via its broadcast networks in a national or regional emergency. And that's the end of the letter. Radio 4 on longwave will switch off, whether we like it or not, whether us radio buffs consider it an important part of broadcasting history, whether we feel it's beneficial to an emergency communications framework in the UK, or whether people in more remote areas consider it an important lifeline to the outside world. When Hintz Hill 405 line television transmitter was switched off for the very last time, just a handful of old television sets went blank. The shutdown was scarcely noticed by millions of television viewers up and down the country, but for a team of engineers at the remote station on Hintz Hill, it was the end of an era. For 29 years, it transmitted 5 million adverts and 250,000 programmes on the now outmoded 405 line sets all over the country. Now, television had 625 lines, and the viewers in the area of Hintz Hill were receiving their programming from Sutton Coldfield. This was viewed as a better television standard with scope for technical improvement, better quality pictures, particularly on larger receiver screens. The Home Secretary announced in 1983 that all remaining 405 line VHF, BBC and ITA transmitters would be closed down by the end of 1984. The 405 line monochrome analogue television broadcasting system was the first fully electronic television system to be used in regular broadcasting. It was introduced with the BBC television service in 1936. As a result of this decision, the BBC and IBA had to revise their programme for the closure of the remaining transmitters, which was already underway. It seemed that lower population and more rural and remote areas were targeted first. 4 low-power 405-line television relays in Devon and Cornwall were switched off during the first week of January 1981. The stations in Devon and Cornwall were at Oakhampton, Bude, Bodmin and the Isles of Scilly. In the areas they served, the BBC One service with BBC Two and ITV was already available on 625 lines. The main BBC One 405-line transmitters for Devon and Cornwall were at North Hessery Tor on Dartmoor and at Red Ruth. They remained operating until later in the closure plan. Viewers in Ballachulish and Kinlochleven lost their 405-line service on the 4th of January 1982, when at 1:30 p.m, 2 405-line transmitters were switched off. The switch-off was performed by BBC engineer Peter Lister, who was responsible for maintaining many of the small relay stations provided by the BBC in the West Highlands. The 405-line transmitter at Belmont was closed down in April 1982. 3 405-line transmitters in northwest Wales closed on January 2, 1983. They were Arfon, Llandonna and Holyhead. In December 1982, the IBA and BBC wanted to hear from viewers in the area using old 405-line sets who would be affected by the changes. Only a relatively small number depended on this service because the 625-line services of BBC Wales, BBC Two, HTV Wales and S4C already reached 96% of the population. The number was being further reduced by the opening of additional 625-line UHF relay stations, but some people in remote, hilly areas would still be without UHF television. If viewers lived in areas where it wasn't possible to receive BBC Two, which was transmitted solely on UHF on 625 lines, they could be fairly certain they were dependent on the 405-line service. 2 IBA transmitters at Durris near Aberdeen and Angus near Dundee closed at the end of programmes on Saturday the 5th of July 1984. Closure of the Durris Channel 9 transmitter was brought forward by a few months in order to speed up the installation of the replacement for the UHF 625-line aerial that was damaged in January. The number of viewers identified as still depending on the 405-line service from Durris was less than 50. 405-line and 625-line television transmitters did coexist for many years. In 1964, the BBC launched its BBC Two service on UHF using only a 625-line system, which older sets could not receive. For several years, BBC One and ITV transmitted using the 405-line and BBC Two with a 625-line standard. The only way to receive them all was via a dual standard 405 and 625-line VHF and UHF receiver. The introduction of colour on BBC Two in 1967 necessitated an even more complex dual standard set to receive all 3 channels, with BBC Two in colour. By 1968 and 1969, the different ITV regional channels and BBC One switched over to broadcasting on the 625 line as well as the 405 line, a process which once completed meant that only 625 lines were necessary to receive all channels, with dual standard receivers no longer necessary. In November 1969, BBC One and ITV started broadcasting in 625-line PAL colour on UHF. Their programming was now entirely produced using the new 625-line standard, and therefore the 405-line broadcasts served only as a rebroadcast in monochrome for people who didn't have the newer receivers and could only receive BBC One and ITV. This situation continued up until the time of the 405-line main switch-off on the 3rd and 4th of January 1985, with 405-line VHF broadcasts only being able to be picked up on BBC One and ITV regionals and in monochrome only, while 625-line UHF broadcasts could also broadcast BBC Two and Channel 4 and S4C in addition to BBC One and ITV, and in either colour or monochrome. It was widely reported that a relatively small number of viewers depended on the 405-line service because the 625-line services of BBC One and BBC Two and ITV already reached over 99% of the population, and Channel 4 almost 90%. This number was being further reduced by the additional 625-line UHF relay stations that were being built at a rate of about 60 a year. In his statement, the Home Secretary recognised that some people in scattered communities throughout the United Kingdom would still be without UHF television by the end of 1988. Most of these people lived in remote, hilly areas of the country. If viewers lived in areas where it was not possible to receive BBC Two, which was transmitted solely on UHF on 625 lines, they could be fairly certain that they were dependent on the 405 line service for their television viewing. Affected viewers were advised to send their names and addresses for further information to the BBC Engineering Department at Broadcasting House in London or the Engineering Information Service of the IBA at Crawley Court in Hampshire. Viewers were advised to do this before the stations began to close down. The BBC 405 line television stations affected carried announcements showing the above addresses for about a week before they were due to close. One source claims that a transmitter was switched off in a particular area and nobody was told to see what would happen. They didn't receive one complaint by all accounts. The last 405 line only sets were made in around 1958. Some sources claim that it was 1964 and even 1970. If anybody knows, leave a comment below. For the few places to which UHF didn't stretch, special measures had to be taken. Under a government self-help scheme, grants were available to help communities with limited or no access to the 625 line UHF television service. This programme involved community-led initiatives to build or modify transmitters to receive the 625 line signal and relay the signal out on 405 line frequencies, as is my understanding. Refunds on black and white television licences were available after the 405 line television service was withdrawn. People who still relied on the service because they lived in places where the new service wasn't available were given refunds on the outstanding portion of their licence. The end of VHF transmissions passed with little comment in 1985, as so few people had VHF, and even dual standard sets would have been rare by then. Lichfield's 100 kilowatt transmitter on Hintz Hill on Channel 8, which I mentioned at the start of the video, closed down just after the TV AM breakfast show on Thursday the 3rd of January 1985. It was believed that less than 10 sets were still in use in the area. Emily Moore was switched off at 2:30 PM on January the 3rd. Ian Lamb, the engineer in charge at the beginning of transmissions, pulled down the main circuit triggers, helped by Jack Charlton, the engineer mainly responsible for work on the 405 line equipment towards the end of its life. The first 405 line transmission from Emily Moore went out in November 1956, and at the time of closure, only a handful of sets were believed to be in use. The rest of the BBC and IBA 405 line transmitters were switched off in the early hours of the 3rd and 4th of January 1985. The BBC Scottish transmitters were turned off on the 4th because of an extra bank holiday at the New Year. Many engineers weren't sorry to see the transmitters go. They were obsolete and difficult to get spare parts for when they went wrong. The 405 line network from both the BBC and IBA was on its last legs even by the late 1970s, as no parts were available to maintain them by all accounts. TV engineers and repairmen were certainly seeing less and less 405 line sets in for work in the years running up to the switch off. By 1984 they were lucky to see any at all. Those left without a TV signal received little sympathy, as it was viewed that it was their own fault, and that they had years to upgrade their TV sets, but it's important to remember that at the time of the switch-off, there was still another 3 or 4 years worth of new relays to roll out in order to serve everyone. They still had 405 line sets because they simply couldn't receive UHF yet, and let's not forget the people that couldn't afford a new set. The whole point of me covering the topic of the 405 line switch-off is that it bears a remarkable resemblance to what we face today. The Radio 4 Longwave infrastructure is ageing, hard to get parts for, and is reaching the end of its serviceable life. Many argue this, but it's the BBC that's saying it, and the buck really stops with them. Radio 4 on Longwave is still a vital service for those in remote areas, those with limited technology, the elderly and the lonely, but the number of these people is irrelevant, just like it was with the 405 line viewers that relied on it. The official line in the early 1980s was that other means of watching are there or are coming, so you'll just have to adapt. This is certainly the line the BBC is taking. Maybe it's time to just enjoy Radio 4 on Longwave while we can, and when Droitwich, Westerglen and Berghead are switched off, which is still planned for some time this year, we all need to just get over it and move on. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.